Hello and a very warm welcome to the channel. Something a little bit different today, so this is not a strict reaction, but it's not far off. So some of you guys on my main channel have been suggesting I react to epic rap battles of history, which is a genius YouTube channel. Quite rightly, they've got billions of views. There's a slight problem with that. I can't react to it because I've already seen them all and I've seen most of them more than once. And in fact, I've even interviewed Lodbrok, I think it's pronounced, who is one of the one of the two co-creators for a newspaper I used to work for. So I cannot react to them, but what I can do is something a little bit different. I want to go through them, especially the ones that are purely historically based or largely based around history, and explain the historical references, because those guys do really, really well. Like, they put in really quite obscure historic references. So I wanted to kind of go through and show just how much history they're fitting into these genuinely hilarious encounters. So let's kick off with Richard the Lionheart versus Ragnar Lodbrok. Now, Ragnar Lodbrok is the sort of semi-historical figure, semi-mythical, kind of in the same realm as King Arthur, but we can get into that in the video. So yeah, let's make it play.
This video is sponsored by Rise of Kingdoms.
Yeah.
Richard the Lion versus
No.
I'm Richard the First from the Third Crusade. That only leaves room for you in second place.
Right, so straight off the bat, so of course Richard is most famous for the Third Crusade. He was one of its leaders, probably its most important leader, so it's sometimes also called the King's Crusade, because in contrast to the First and Second Crusades, it was led by three kings, being Philip II of France, Richard I of England, although really of the Angevin Empire, so he had a lot of land in France, and arguably his French holdings were as important to him as the Kingdom of England. And culturally he was kind of more French than English. And then Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, who drowned on the way and didn't actually make it to the Holy Land, and most of his army then turned back. So the Third Crusade, actually one of the more successful crusades, got very close to retaking Jerusalem, didn't do anything completely mental, like the Fourth Crusade and sacked Constantinople. Wasn't a complete debacle like the Second Crusade. So yeah, one of the more successful ones, but didn't complete its core objective. But he was racked throughout by infighting between Richard I and Philip II.
Chivalrous swinger of the sword and mace, and I kill you when I spit like a pit bull of snake. I'm the number one.
So that is a reference to how Ragnar Lodbrok died. So okay, we should go into Ragnar Lodbrok a bit. So Ragnar Lodbrok is probably based on a real person. There's some dispute over this, but there's probably some real person that the legend is loosely based around. But our kind of understanding of the legend comes from various stories, particularly from Icelandic sagas from the Middle Ages. Clearly they are not historical. That being said, quite a few of the people who are referred to as his sons definitely are historical figures. Now, of course, if that means he's probably not their actual fathers. They may have been trying to claim a link to him through kind of gain legitimacy through association with a great, even if non-existent leader. But so he is a mythical figure, probably based on a real figure. But some of his sons, who I believe we're going to come to later, are very much historical figures.
One dick rising up to make you feel small. One battering ram slams through your steel wall. I'll announce it.
So a shield wall is the standard way of fighting at this time in northwestern Europe. Very infantry based. Essentially, you have two armies interlocking shields to provide protection from the left, the right, and the centre, and then they will just crash together and be very, very brutal. And eventually, one side would collapse.
The next of your things that I'm chopping through your family like boneless wings. Of course you got avenged by a kid with no bones. Your own story.
So this is a reference to Ivan the Boneless, who was one of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army. He was one of the supposed sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, but unlike Ragnar, Ivan is definitely a real historical character. And the Great Heathen Army was probably the most formidable, almost certainly the most formidable Viking army ever to invade England, with the possible exception of Harold Hardrada in 1066. And it conquered most of England. It was the Kingdom of Wessex held out, and it established what came known as Danelaw, which is kind of a Danish-occupied zone of England, which lasted for about 250 years or so. Eventually Wessex would fight back and form the Kingdom of England as we know it today.
Ended worse than Game of Thrones. Son killed your ex killed your wife. messed up circle of life.
Right, so Richard the First is like the last person in the fucking world who should be making references to someone having a messed up family. Well, Richard the First launched 2 armed rebellions against his own father. His father was Henry II of England. He was supported in some by some of his brothers, but not necessarily by all of them. His Eleanor of Castile, who was Henry II's wife and his mother, was originally the partner of or was originally wife of the King of France, and then left the King of France, married the King of England, Henry II. That family is a complete shit show. I cannot emphasise this enough. During his own reign, of course, Richard was facing constant problems from his younger brother John, which is a big reason why he had to come back from the Third Crusade. So yeah, Richard, knock it off, mate. You haven't got a leg to stand on that one.
Half-ass head taps can't be condoned. It's like you raided the face of Post Malone. I'm scared of no foe. I'm backed by the Trinity. I'll conquer you on my day off like you were Sicily.
Right, so the Sicily reference. On the way to the Third Crusade, Richard managed to conquer not 1 but 2 quite major European islands, or sort of conquer. So the first was Sicily. He arrived in Sicily with the English army, or the Angevin army. And the King of Sicily had recently died, and a usurper had seized the throne. Now, the issue was that Richard's sister was the widow of the dead King of Sicily. Obviously, in this time, European royal families were all interbred for political reasons, political marriages. And the usurper decided to put her in prison, and also refused to give her her share of the inheritance. Now, obviously, Richard was not best happy about that. So Richard landed his army, they sacked the city of Messina, and eventually the usurper king agreed to their demands, and she was released, and she got a lot of money. Oh, the second one actually is even more interesting. The second one is Cyprus. So his fiancée was shipwrecked off the coast of Cyprus on the way to the Holy Land on the Third Crusade. She was captured by essentially a Byzantine usurper. It was a guy who had been appointed to run the island, but had basically declared himself to be independent. He would later have a stab at the Byzantine throne itself, but that's another subject. So he captured her, refused to let her go, so Richard landed his army, conquered Cyprus, pushed off the usurper, and actually sold it first of all to the Knights Templar, and then eventually it became the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which is one of the Crusader states that lasted for several hundred years actually.
To conquer Ragnar's
Sorry, not the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Kingdom of Cyprus. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is a separate Crusader state, getting lost. Yeah, but it became the Kingdom of Cyprus, which lasted several hundred years.
old for a king who got whacked by a 10-year-old. I'll sacrifice it.
Right, so the whacked by a 10-year-old, this is a reference to Richard's death. So he died after, he was captured, returning from the Third Crusade, held by the Holy Roman Emperor. He was eventually released, and he was putting down a rebellion in one of his French possessions, and he was sieging a castle, and he was killed by a crossbow. Well, he got struck by a crossbow and got injured. The injury became infected. Obviously, medication in those days was pretty bad, and he died. Now, the story behind this is that the guy that fired the crossbow turned out to be a boy, because Richard demanded to, once the settlement surrendered, Richard demanded to meet the person who'd fired the fatal shot. And it turned out to be a young boy who was furious because Richard had killed his father and 2 brothers, I think. Now the story goes that Richard was sort of overcome and offered the kid forgiveness and said, and actually gave him some money and sent him away. Although it has a pretty unhappy ending, because once Richard actually died, one of his mercenary captains apparently captured this kid and flayed him alive. So again, that's not canon. We're not totally sure that all happened, but that's where this reference comes from.
To oath while drinking horns of mead. Good thing you hold the red cross, cause that's how you're going to need. You built your army by raising English taxes.
And this is true. So the raising English taxes, Richard I put horrendous taxes on England to finance the First Crusade. They're called the Saladin Teeth, and it affected pretty much every aspect of English society. He had to raise a huge amount of money, which he did, but at a huge cost of the kingdom. I mean, there's an argument that whilst Richard I was undoubtedly a great king of England, he was terrible for England itself, because England was ravaged, first of all, to pay for the Third Crusade, second of all, kind of during his absence for political instability, and then to pay for his ransom.
raise my army taxing English asses with my axes. And who are you to talk about the circle of life? Your old lady can't feel the love on any night.
Right, so this is a reference. Well, it's possibly several references. So Richard had no legitimate heirs. He had possibly one illegitimate, I think he had one definitely confirmed illegitimate son. There may have been more, but there were always suspicions that he took homosexual lovers. Now, that's not confirmed. We don't know that for fact, but that's always been the rumour. So this is obviously a reference to the fact he didn't have a legitimate heir, and possibly also was bisexual or possibly homosexual, although we're pretty confident he had sex with some women, so I guess bisexual.
Your only son was illegitimate. You out of the side. It was just fine like the end of the Plantagenet line. I'm just a warrior.
Richard the First was the second of the Plantagenet kings of England, a very long, illustrious, and defining dynasty of English kings. The first being his father, Henry II.
I'm not the linguist, but I think the king of England should probably speak English. You took Acre and Jaffa.
So that's a great reference. Obviously, it's a great reference as well. So I'm actually going to skip back. So the speak English bit. There's no. Richard was born. We think he was born near Oxford, but there's no record that he ever spoke English. We don't know. He may have done, but there's no record of it. He definitely spoke French, and he definitely spoke a regional language from the south of France. It's called something like Akkadian. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But yeah, culturally he was more French than he was English in many ways. He spent most of his life out of England. The entire time he was actually King of England, he was probably in the country about 6 months. So yeah, this is where the reference comes from. He's pretty much as French as he was English.
You took Acre and Jaffa like a piece of cake.
So I love this reference because I love Jaffa cakes, and the Acre and Jaffa both fell to the Crusaders during the Third Crusade. Acre, in particular, Richard I, the Lionheart, was very heavily involved in. In particular, there's a very infamous episode. Several thousand Muslims were taken prisoner after the siege of Acre. So, but both Acre and Jaffa are in modern Israel, just for reference. And these prisoners, several thousand, were executed on Richard's orders. So yeah, he was a really seriously brutal guy.
We never attacked Jerusalem for Christ's sake! Saw the Holy Land, but couldn't go all the way! We should call it the Crusade of Richard the First base!
Right, so this is... they got so close to Jerusalem. They marched on Jerusalem twice, turned back twice. Once was kind of because the weather was terrible. The second time, there were a lot of divisions within the Crusader camp. And Richard actually wanted to attack Egypt, which was Saladin's power base. But yeah, they got very, very close. And arguably, if they'd been really determined to seize Jerusalem, they possibly could have taken it. But then they probably would have lost it afterwards. So maybe nothing gained.
Sail back north with your barbarian goon, because I'm tearing down your legacy, leaving it in ruins. Your real self next to your legend disappoints. I see you shaking in your shaggy little pants like soy. Who invented the royal me? We. Who's the predominantly fictional MC? Thee. You're a wannabe, mon ami. Kneel down and honor me. Richard coming through in the end like Sean Connery. The double correlated blood and gore me. You might have the axe, but I make a body spray. And I'm just overcame and I struck like a cobra. If I wanted to fight loser Vikings, I'd go to Minnesota.
Okay, if there's one thing I'm not qualified to talk about, it's American football. So yeah, NFL, please guys, if you're into NFL, explain to me in the comments why Minnesota are apparently terrible.
To fight me? Take off the tin shirt. I've been waiting in my birthday suit, going berserk. Ding dong, morning bells warn about me at the break of dawn. And I'm putting you to sleep like your brother John.
Right, so I've let it run for a little bit. So the thing about going berserk, that was a thing some Vikings used to do, where they would take hallucinogenic drugs, get very, very drunk, and become basically fanatical. The monks, yeah.
The monks in chunks on Northumbrian lawns.
So the monks in chunks on Northumbrian lawns, the Vikings heavily targeted monasteries. Why? Because they were rich and isolated, which made them incredibly vulnerable, which was actually a bit stupid. So the first major Viking raid was on Lindisfarne, which was part of the kingdom of Northumbria. And they were just easy targets, basically. And they had lots of stuff to nick from them.
Because I'm the old father spawn! You couldn't even beat a Saladin in the fight!
So this is the genius line. So Saladin, or Saladin, was the leader of the Muslim armies who fought against the Third Crusade. He's a Sunni Muslim. He was a Kurd. Actually, he wasn't Arab. He was a Kurd. He ended up ruling Egypt and Syria, and actually founding his own dynasty.
You're a self-desmoted Python Knights! You went from chainmail to chained up in jail to mummy.
So that's true. It was actually a very strange story. So on his way back to England, or was trying to get back to England after the Third Crusade, Richard was. He got stuck. There was a whole series of complications. He'd fallen out with the Byzantine Emperor for reasons to do with his attack on Cyprus, which was theoretically part of the Byzantine Empire, even though it de facto was operating independently and Richard attacked it. But yes, he'd fallen out with them, so he had to make an overland voyage at one point in disguise, but he was captured by an associate of the Holy Roman Emperor, and eventually handed to the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the Pope kind of got involved a bit, but the Pope didn't excommunicate the Holy Roman Emperor, which really annoyed Richard. And they had to pay an enormous ransom. It was several years' worth of the English royal treasury. So obviously that meant lots of taxes for everyone before he was eventually released.
Great England to pay for your bail! But no king's ransom will save you from these bars, son. I'm eating you alive like the gangrene you died from.
So obviously that is a reference to the crossbow bolt going gangrene, and the infection from that killing him. So that was, I thought that was really well done. It's really interesting pitting a definite historical figure against one who is somewhere between being fully historical and being a myth. So in that sense, I'd say Ragnar Lodbrok's kind of like, for example, King Arthur, who would have been, his history would have existed a few hundred years before, theoretically led the defence of Britain against the Anglo-Saxon invaders. Now, there probably was a King Arthur of some sort, or there was some figure he was loosely based on, but obviously the legend has virtually nothing to do with it. But anyway, I really enjoyed that. I hope you guys find that interesting. If you do, please do hit that subscribe button, hit the like button. It really does help with the channel, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.